Have you ever seen someone be humiliated and then come back in such an epic way that everyone gave a standing ovation? Get ready, because this story will leave you speechless. Imagine being on a peaceful flight, surrounded by strangers, until someone decides to belittle you without knowing that you are about to make the biggest mistake of your life. What if I told you that sometimes karma acts faster than you imagine, that arrogance can be punished right there, in front of a plane full of witnesses? Today, you'll see how poetic justice can happen in the most unexpected places, and how a simple first-class flight became the stage for one of the biggest comebacks ever seen. What began as a moment of prejudice and arrogance ended with an ending so satisfying that it made everyone on the plane cheer. And who is responsible for this unforgettable lesson? None other than Snoop Dogg. But be careful. This story is not just about revenge or humiliation. It's about respect, about how we should never judge people by their appearance. Because sometimes the one you try to put down is the person who can teach you the greatest lesson of your life. Stay until the end, because what happens in the last moments of this flight will leave you shocked and with a smile on your face. Snoop Dogg took his time getting on the plane, wearing a simple sweatshirt, comfortable pants, and a cap covering part of his face. Nothing flashy, nothing extravagant, just someone looking for a smooth flight. No security guards, no staff, just him and his music on his headphones. For him, this was a moment of rest, away from the spotlight, away from the cameras. But for a certain passenger, it was an opportunity to demonstrate arrogance. As soon as Snoop took his seat in first class, getting ready for a worry-free flight, he noticed a cross look coming from a few seats next to him. It wasn't just any look. It was that kind of expression, full of judgment, of superiority, as if someone was uncomfortable with the simple presence of another person in a space that, in his mind, should be exclusive to a certain type of people. The man in question was dressed in an impeccable suit, shoes shining as if they had just come out of the box, an expensive watch glinting with every movement of his wrist. He had all the posture of a typical high-ranking businessman, someone used to being served, flattered, and treated as a priority. And at that moment, he couldn't hide his discomfort at having a passenger like Snoop Dogg sitting in the same luxury cabin as him. First, it was just looks. A frown here, an impatient sigh there. Small gestures that revealed the discomfort. But then, the comments started. Low enough to sound subtle, but loud enough for Snoop to hear. "First class is becoming very affordable lately," said the man, looking out of the corner of his eye. Some passengers heard it but avoided getting involved. No one wanted to get into an unnecessary argument before the plane even took off. But Snoop just smiled faintly, as if he hadn't heard. He had already experienced that before. I already knew exactly what to expect from people like that. The man continued, now turning to the passenger next to him, as if wanting an ally for his contempt. In the old days, traveling first class meant something. Nowadays, anyone can sit here. The woman next to him laughed awkwardly, trying to change the subject, but he seemed determined to continue. He looked at Snoop Dogg again, analyzing him from head to toe, as if trying to fit him into some stereotype that made sense in his head. I bet he must be one of those internet influencers. Nowadays, everyone thinks they can flaunt it. This time, Snoop Dogg looked up and faced the man directly, not angry, not irritated, just a calm look, but full of meaning. The businessman, realizing that he had been noticed, pretended to ignore it and went back to using his cell phone, satisfied with himself. For him, he had made his message clear. The flight attendant passed by offering drinks before takeoff, and, upon reaching the businessman, he smiled exaggeratedly and said in a louder tone of voice than necessary, "Champagne, please. I need to keep the trip level, if you know what I mean." The comment was directed at no one in specific, but everyone there knew very well what he meant. Some passengers exchanged discreet glances, noticing the growing tension. Snoop Dogg, in turn, remained impassive. He just continued there calmly, without giving the reaction the businessman expected. This seemed to bother the man even more, who now crossed his arms and looked out the window, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of sharing such an exclusive space with someone who, in his view, didn't belong there. But what he didn't know was that he was about to receive one of the greatest lessons of his life. The plane began to prepare for takeoff. Passengers adjusted their seatbelts, flight attendants carried out final checks, and at that moment, everything seemed to be going on normally. The businessman already thought he was victorious, believing that he had established his superiority, that he had made it clear who was in charge in that environment, but he had no idea what was coming. He didn't know that in just a few minutes, his little show of arrogance would turn against him in a way he never imagined. He didn't know he was about to find out, in the worst way possible, that judging someone by their appearance can be a humiliating mistake. And the worst of all, he still hadn't realized who was actually sitting next to him. And now I ask you, what would you do if you were in Snoop Dogg's shoes? Would you let this provocation pass, or would you respond immediately? Tell us here in the comments, because I want to know your opinion. This story is a powerful reminder that respect must come before any status or appearance. Life has an interesting way of teaching lessons to those who think they are superior. And if there's anything we learn from stories like this, it's that justice always finds its way. So enjoy and share this video with your friends, because this is one of those stories that everyone needs to see. Have you ever been through something similar? Have you ever witnessed someone being judged for no reason? Write here in the comments, because I read each one of them. Oh, and don't forget, leave a like if you believe that respect is essential. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and activate the bell so you don't miss any epic twists like the one that's coming. Because now comes the best part. The moment when everything changes, that moment when a businessman realizes he made the biggest mistake of his life. And Snoop Dogg's reaction? Well, that left the entire plane speechless. Hold on tight, because you won't want to miss what comes next. The atmosphere inside first class seemed calm to most passengers, but for this businessman, something was deeply bothering him. He glanced at Snoop Dogg from time to time, wrinkling his nose, frowning, showing barely concealed contempt. He seemed disturbed by the simple fact that he was sharing that luxurious space with someone who, in his opinion, didn't fit in there. But contrary to what he might have expected, Snoop Dogg remained impassive. The businessman let out an exaggerated sigh, rolled his eyes, and finally decided to act. He waved at the flight attendant with an impatient gesture, as if he were calling an employee to resolve an urgent problem. When she approached, he straightened his jacket and lowered his voice, but made sure to speak loud enough so that some people around him could hear. Look, I don't want to sound unpleasant, but I think there was a mistake here. That seat, are you sure it was reserved correctly? The flight attendant blinked, surprised by the question, and quickly consulted her clipboard. Yes, sir, all seats were checked before boarding. Is there a problem? The businessman paused dramatically, and then cast a quick glance at Snoop Dogg, who remained relaxed in his seat listening to music. No, I just found it curious. In the past, first class was a more selective space. Now it seems like anyone can sit here. The prejudiced comment caused some passengers to look at each other. The professional flight attendant maintained a forced smile, but her expression made it clear that she understood exactly what was happening. Snoop Dogg, who until that moment was just observing everything without reacting, paused the music on his headphones and slightly tilted his head to the side, capturing every word. But he didn't say anything. He just continued there, calmly, looking serenely at the businessman. And this calm, this lack of immediate response, seemed to irritate the man even more. The businessman smirked, pleased with himself, as if he believed he had made his point clear. He picked up a magazine, pretending to be distracted, but his posture still brimmed with arrogance. Snoop Dogg, on the other hand, just took a deep breath and looked straight ahead again, as if none of it affected him. He had been in situations like this before. I already knew well the type of person who needed to put others down to feel superior, but the businessman was not satisfied. He wanted to provoke. He wanted Snoop Dogg to feel uncomfortable. Then he crossed his legs, discreetly turned to the passenger next to him and said, in a tone that seemed casual but carried venom, "The world is really changing, isn't it?" Before, we knew exactly what kind of person we would find here. Now it seems like we can no longer be sure of anything. The insinuation was clear. And now some passengers have started to pay more attention. The tension in the air was becoming palpable. The flight attendant, who was still nearby, pursed her lips as if she wanted to say something but preferred to avoid a confrontation. Snoop Dogg remained calm, but now a slight smile was forming at the corner of his lips. He didn't need to respond at that moment. He knew that life had a way of teaching arrogant people lessons. The businessman, in turn, sat back in his seat, satisfied with himself. For him, he had won. He had made his point clear. He had shown that, in his distorted view of the world, some people simply didn't belong in certain places. Little did he know that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life, because on that flight he wasn't the only one who knew how to play this game, and the answer he would receive would be something he would never forget. The silence on the plane seemed to grow by the second. The tension in the air was already noticeable, and even those who weren't paying attention before now felt that something was about to happen. The businessman, confident and increasingly convinced of his own importance, straightened his tie, looked around and decided it was time to turn his insinuations into something even more direct. For him, the simple fact that Snoop Dogg was there, sitting calmly, without reacting to his provocations, was reason enough to further test the limits of the situation. He let out a short laugh, full of sarcasm, and turned completely towards Snoop Dogg. His tone of voice was loud enough for everyone around him to hear clearly. "I think someone got the wrong seat. First class is for premium customers." The comment hung in the air like a sharp knife, cutting the room in two. Some people looked away, pretending they hadn't heard anything, while others held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. One of the flight attendants, who until then had remained professionally neutral, pursed her lips, visibly uncomfortable. But the businessman didn't stop there. He wanted to make sure his message was understood. He wanted to humiliate. He wanted to make it clear to everyone that, in his worldview, some people simply didn't belong in certain places. If you want comfort, friend, there are some really good seats in economy class. Now, there was no longer any doubt about his intentions. He wasn't just hinting. He was verbalizing in all words that in his head, Snoop Dogg was not worthy of that space. What he didn't know was that he was about to make a mistake that would completely change the course of that trip. The atmosphere became heavy. The energy inside the cabin changed instantly. Some passengers glanced at Snoop Dogg, waiting to see if he would react. Others exchanged discreet glances with each other, uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. The businessman himself, upon realizing that he had caught everyone's attention, gave a slight, satisfied smile, as if he were in control of the situation. But Snoop Dogg remained motionless. He didn't move, didn't change his expression. He just looked at the businessman with a serene look, as if watching a regrettable spectacle taking place in front of him. And this lack of reaction seemed to bother the businessman even more. He expected something different. Perhaps an exasperated response, an attempted defense, a confrontation, but what he received was absolute silence. And that silence spoke louder than any words. The flight attendant, realizing that the situation was getting out of control, decided to intervene. She approached the businessman with a tense smile and an impeccable professional posture. trying to calm things down before the situation escalated further. "Sir, all passengers in this cabin are properly accommodated. If there is any problem with your seat, I can check for you, but as far as I know, everything is correct." The businessman shook his head, pretending to laugh in disdain. "Oh, of course. Nowadays, anyone can afford a seat like that, right? But everything is fine. Not everyone understands the real value of being here." The dismissive tone was impossible to ignore. Now, the eyes were divided between him and Snoop Dogg. The rapper, who until then had not shown any emotion other than absolute calm, leaned forward slightly, rested his elbows on his knees, and looked directly into the businessman's eyes. For a brief moment there was absolute silence, and it was at that moment that something changed. The businessman, who until then felt secure in his superior role, realized that there was something different in that look. It wasn't anger. It wasn't frustration. It wasn't even irritation. It was something much worse for him. It was the look of someone who knew exactly what was going on. From someone who had been in situations like this countless times, and who, in each case, knew exactly how to act. The businessman swallowed hard, but maintained his arrogant expression. "I still believed I had control of the situation, but little did he know that that flight was about to become the biggest embarrassment of his life. And what would happen in the next few minutes would completely change the way he saw the world." The businessman still maintained a posture of superiority, as if he had just proved a point, as if he had established in front of everyone that there, in that exclusive space, he was the one dictating the rules of who belonged and who didn't. His disdainful gaze was still fixed on Snoop Dogg, waiting for some reaction, some sign of discomfort or embarrassment. But all he received was that same serene, silent look. And that bothered him deeply. The tension inside the plane was palpable. All first-class passengers were attentive to what was happening, even those who pretended not to be paying attention. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others just watched in silence. The businessman straightened up, took out his cell phone, and pretended to check something, as if he wanted to show that he no longer cared. But the truth was that he was waiting for an answer. He wanted Snoop Dogg to defend himself, to say something that would further justify his arrogant attitude. But nothing happened. Then, before any other words were said, the flight attendant returned, now with a big smile, an even more attentive posture, and, in his hand, a crystal glass perfectly served with an exclusive drink. She bowed slightly towards Snoop Dogg, her tone respectful and full of consideration. "Mr. Dogg, would you like your usual special drink?" The silence that followed was instantaneous, as if time itself had stopped for a moment. The entire plane seemed to freeze. The businessman, who had been so sure of himself until that moment, opened his eyes wide, blinking a few times, as if he needed to process what he had just heard. "Mr. Dogg." The whispers started almost immediately. Some passengers exchanged discreet glances. Others didn't even bother to hide the shock on their faces. Those who hadn't yet realized who was sitting next to them now knew exactly who they were dealing with. The businessman, who seconds ago was completely convinced that he had control of the situation, suddenly became rigid. His gaze went from the flight attendant's face to Snoop Dogg, and then to the other passengers, as if trying to understand what was happening. But Snoop Dogg did nothing. He didn't need to say anything. He just calmly took the glass, took a small sip, and with an almost imperceptible smile, returned his gaze to the businessman. And in that instant, the game completely changed. What was once a moment of humiliation had now turned into one of the biggest embarrassments of that businessman's life. The change in his expression was subtle but noticeable. The arrogant assurance he carried minutes before was quickly crumbling. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. The flight attendant, still maintaining a polite tone, but now with a slight shadow of satisfaction on her face, added, "If you need anything, Mr. Dogg, we are at your disposal." And then she walked away, leaving the businessman there, trying to regain his composure. But it was already too late. The passengers continued whispering. Some people hid their smiles, others just watched to see what the next move would be. The businessman nervously fidgeted with his wristwatch, as if he was looking for some distraction, some way to escape the overwhelming discomfort that was now falling upon him. A Snoop Dogg. He just continued there, completely in control, without needing to say a single word. And now I want to know, if you were on that plane, what would you do right now? Would you continue pretending you didn't see anything, or would you take a discreet look to see the businessman's reaction? Comment below. I saw everything if you would have paid attention to every detail of this epic moment. The businessman remained motionless, desperately trying to process what had just happened. His face, once full of confidence and arrogance, now showed something he probably didn't feel often: pure embarrassment. His gaze flickered between the surrounding passengers, who now no longer made a point of hiding their surprised and, in some cases, amused expressions. The game had turned. Snoop Dogg, on the other hand, maintained his absolute calm. He picked up his crystal glass, swirled the drink lightly between his fingers, and then, with a discreet smile, looked up at the businessman, who still seemed to be struggling to find some dignified way out of the situation. It was then that, without rushing and with a tone full of subtle irony, he said, "Looks like someone chose the wrong seat today, huh?" It was enough. The entire plane, which until then had been plunged into a tense silence, burst into laughter, some discreet, others more open, but all charged with the same energy. That was the turning point that no one expected, but that everyone felt immense satisfaction in witnessing. The businessman, who until minutes ago felt in control of the situation, was now the center of the joke. He tried to smile, as if to demonstrate that he hadn't been hit, but it was clear that his confidence had completely crumbled. His face turned red, his fingers drummed against the table in front of him, and his posture, once erect and imposing, now seemed smaller, more withdrawn. The flight attendant, still maintaining her impeccably professional expression, decided to seal the moment once and for all. With a polite but meaningful tone, she smiled and said, "By the way, Mr. Dogg, the captain asked to let you know that your friend is already waiting in the VIP lounge after landing." The businessman opened his eyes wide once again. He had already understood that he had made a serious mistake, but this information came as a final blow. Snoop Dogg wasn't just another first-class passenger. He was such a respected figure that even the flight captain wanted to make sure everything was perfect for him. The businessman ran his hand over his face, trying to hide his embarrassment, but it was too late. Everyone around was watching his silent defeat. His castle of superiority, built on prejudice and arrogance, had crumbled before everyone's eyes. Snoop Dogg, without needing to raise his voice or make any grand gestures, had shown him, and everyone on the plane, one of the greatest lessons he could learn. And you, what would you do if you were on that flight and witnessed a turn of events like this? Would you laugh along, or just watch the businessman wallow in his own mistakes? Comment below. Karma acts quickly to show that you followed this epic moment, and believe that justice always finds a way to happen, but hold on, because it's not over yet. The businessman may have been exposed in front of everyone, but what comes next is even more surprising, because, on that flight, the lesson was not yet complete, and what happens in the next few minutes will make this story even more unbelievable. The businessman sank into the armchair as if he wanted to disappear. His face, once full of confidence and arrogance, was now flushed. His eyes avoided any direct contact, and his hands, once gesturing firmly while expressing his contempt, now rested tensely on his legs. He stared at the small table in front of him, as if hoping that it would somehow teleport him away from that situation. But there was no escape. The passengers around were still exchanging glances, some trying to hold back their laughter, Others, not even disguising their satisfaction at seeing such a presumptuous man receive such a deserved lesson. The energy in the cabin had completely changed. If before the businessman felt entitled to judge and belittle someone just for their appearance, now he was the target of all eyes, and this time he was not in control. Snoop Dogg, on the other hand, remained calm. He didn't need to humiliate the businessman. There was no need to scream or fight back angrily. His posture said it all. He just raised his glass, took another sip calmly, and without rushing slowly turned to the businessman. The silence was heavy. The businessman realized he was being watched, and, against his own will, looked up for a brief moment. And it was at that moment that Snoop Dogg, with a serene tone but full of meaning, released the phrase that would seal that moment forever. Don't judge people by their appearance. You never know who might be by your side. It was like a final blow. The businessman blinked a few times. His throat moved dryly as if he were trying to swallow that moment of humiliation. He wanted to respond. He wanted to justify himself. He wanted to at least find a way out to recover some of the dignity that he himself destroyed. But there was nothing he could say. No words would be enough to erase what happened. The passengers did not hold back. A new buzz filled the cabin, and some people nodded in approval. That was the kind of response anyone would have liked to have given in a moment of injustice. It was the perfect poetic revenge, one where the story's villain learns his lesson without anyone needing to raise their voice or lose their cool. The flight attendant, who had been a witness to everything, approached again, now with an almost amused tone of voice. "Mr. Dogg, if you need anything else, we will be at your disposal." The businessman closed his eyes for a second, pressing his lips together, visibly frustrated with himself. He knew that any wrong reaction would only make the situation worse, but the damage was already done. He tried to compose himself, straightened his tie, ran his hand through his hair, and pretended to check his watch, as if nothing had happened. But everyone knew the truth. Everyone had seen his arrogance turn to shame in a matter of minutes. Snoop Dogg? He just smiled and relaxed back into his seat, satisfied. For him, this was nothing new. He had seen this type of attitude before. He already knew how to deal with people who think they are superior just because of status, appearance, or money. He knew that the best way to win was not to stoop to their level, but to let life teach them the necessary lesson. And now I want to hear from you. If you were on that flight, what would you do right now? Would you have laughed along with the other passengers, or just watched this poetic revenge unfold right before your eyes? Comment below. Karma doesn't fail if you believe this businessman got exactly what he deserved. But hold on tight, because this story isn't over yet. What happens after this flight will transform this situation into something even more unbelievable. The businessman thought his shame ended there, but he was completely wrong. And in the next few minutes, he would find out the hard way possible that some lessons don't end any time soon. The silence that took over the plane lasted only a few seconds. Seconds that seemed like an eternity for the businessman, who was still trying to process what had happened. But soon, this silence was broken by something unexpected. First, a pair of timid claps coming from a braver passenger. Then someone else started clapping. And then, as if everyone was just waiting for a signal to react, the entire plane burst into applause. The sound echoed through the first-class cabin, spreading like an unstoppable wave. Some passengers laughed, others shook their heads in approval, and even the flight attendant, who had tried to maintain her professional composure the entire time, couldn't help but smile a little in satisfaction. The businessman, in turn, shrank even more in his seat. His face was already completely red, a mix of embarrassment and frustration. He wanted to hide, disappear, pretend none of this was happening, but it was already too late. What started as an arrogant comment and an attempt at humiliation had now turned completely against him. He realized that he was no longer seen as a successful and powerful man. In the eyes of the passengers, he was now just a living example of why one should never judge others by their appearance. He avoided looking around, but he could feel the eyes on him. I could hear the whispers, the suppressed laughter, people exchanging comments. Every laugh, every discreet glance in his direction was a reminder of what he had lost. A Snoop Dogg? He just observed everything with his unshakable calm. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to argue. He didn't need to justify himself. He simply let the businessman destroy himself, a victim of his own arrogance. As the applause began to die down, Snoop Dogg raised his glass in a silent toast, as if he was sealing that moment with class and absolute superiority. And, as if reading the businessman's thoughts, he said in a calm tone full of meaning, "Respect is worth more than any social class." It was the last thrust. The phrase that remained in the air, echoing inside the businessman's mind as an eternal reminder of his defeat. He swallowed hard, but said nothing. There was nothing more to be said. The plane began its descent. The captain announced over the PA system that they would soon land and that everyone should prepare for disembarkation. But for the businessman, that flight had already been long enough. Every minute of sitting there, surrounded by people who witnessed his humiliation, was silent torture. And then the plane landed. Passengers began to get up, grabbing their carry-on luggage and getting ready to leave. But before anyone could take the first step out of the aircraft, the flight attendant approached Snoop Dogg again and said with a polite smile, "Mr. Dogg, we can accompany you to the VIP lounge. Your friend is already waiting for you." The businessman, who was already standing and trying to blend in with the crowd, froze when he heard that. Once again, he was forced to face the reality of who he tried to humiliate. He watched helplessly as Snoop Dogg calmly stood up, put on his sunglasses, and walked with the ease of someone who was already used to being treated with respect, no matter what. And without even needing to look back, he left the businessman something he would never forget, a lesson that didn't come with shouting, didn't come with arguments. It came with the simple truth: never underestimate anyone. Now I ask you, if you had been on that flight, how would you have reacted? Would you have stayed quiet, just watching, or would you have applauded along with the other passengers? Comment below "Respect comes first" to show that you followed this story to the end and believe that no one should be judged by their appearance. And now I want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? If you've made it this far, it's because you've really been involved in every detail of this epic twist. And if there's one thing this story teaches us, it's that respect is always worth more than any luxury, any status, any appearance, and it doesn't stop here. If you liked this story, leave a like right now, because this really helps the channel grow and brings even more impactful stories like this. It is clear, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because here there is always content that will captivate you from beginning to end and leave you with your jaw dropped. And if you want to see another twist as incredible as this, don't waste time, click on the next video that is already appearing on your screen and prepare for another story full of justice and unforgettable lessons. See you there.